Oh, you know what time it is. Guys, welcome back to another episode of the Bible Vlog. It is Acts 27 today, and we have just one more chapter left to go in the entire book of Acts. It's like we just started. Where does the time go when you're having fun? So in chapter 27, we read about Paul's fourth and final missionary journey, and this time it's to Rome. Now let me just say, if you have never been to Rome, you should really make it a point to visit there at least once in your life. I actually got to go there for the first time in my life this last summer, and it was incredible. So much history, so many beautiful churches, such good pizza. Now I know Paul's reasons were very different than going to Rome for my own, but let me just say, those Italians, they know how to make some good food. Okay, where were we? So Paul gets on a ship, and it's supposed to be headed towards Rome for his appeal to Caesar. Now this ship that Paul was most likely on was actually a grain ship that was used for exporting food from Egypt. Now these things were actually pretty massive, and as we'll read later in the chapter, they could hold a lot of people. In fact, on this particular boat that Paul was on, it says that there were 276 people on board, just to give you an idea of the size of this thing. Now the most dangerous time for these ships to actually sail was during mid-September until early November. And then after this time period, there was a pause on all shipping until winter was over. So Paul recognizes that the time that they're going to be sailing in falls within this time period. And listen to what he says to the men in charge in verse 10. Now this is Paul talking. Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. And then in verse 11, nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Now, if there's one thing that would be ill-advised in this situation, it would be ignoring a guy who's known for his handkerchiefs being able to heal the sick. But nonetheless, they attempt to keep going, and so in verse 13 it says, when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous head wind arose. So long story short, these guys get caught in a storm, and it says that they start throwing off all the tackle, all the cargo, everything is going overboard to try and be able to lighten the ship, but nothing is working. It says they can't get out of the storm, but now listen to what happens in verse 20. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Paul is sitting there saying, guys, I told you this was going to happen. But in verse 22, listen to what Paul says. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all of those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told to me. So even though these guys have ignored Paul's warning, God still gives them grace and lets Paul know through an angel that they are going to survive. You know, it's amazing to see in these conditions that the guy with the answer is the one who knows Jesus. It's that peace that the Bible talks about that passes all understanding. That is what Paul has, and these other men recognize it. They've given up hope. They're certain that they're going to die, but Paul is confident because he knows God's faithfulness. So after 14 days, the storm breaks and they end up running the ship aground on the island of Malta, which is actually south of Sicily. Now it says that all the men jumped overboard and they either swam to land or floated to it on parts of the ship. But just like Paul said, not one person died. Everyone is saved, and again, we see God coming through and providing even in the midst of impossible circumstances. If there's one thing that we always see with Paul, it's that he was sure of God's faithfulness. Guys, that is going to be it for us today with Acts 27. We have one more chapter to go before we wrap it up and continue on to the next book. We will see you back here for the final chapter of the book of Acts. I love you guys. We will see you back here tomorrow.